It's so great to see everybody. A lot of people, again, new friends, old friends. Everybody, it's delighted and thank you very much for coming. The event tonight is Student Bodies, a screening with Ho Rui An, who's the artist who produced this work. My name is Jane Debevoise, and I'm the chair of this organization, and now I have been for over 20 years the chair of Asia Art Archive in Hong Kong, but they've demoted me. I'm taking this well, you can see. No, so I'm the chair emeritus of, it makes me feel really old, of Asia Art Archive in Hong Kong. Anyway, we're still more or less the same organizations for people who don't know. Our mothership, as we call it, is in Hong Kong. It's Asia Art Archive in Hong Kong, and that's where we have a much bigger collection of materials in terms of physical materials, library materials. But they do very similar types of programs, so artist residencies, artist talks, bringing in teachers and educators into Hong Kong. Obviously, during the pandemic, is a little bit more complicated than it was in the past, but we're hoping that things are heading in the right direction over there. We share a huge digital archive of primary materials, research materials. They are available here as we are an on-site access point, so we have a ton of it on our website, but that which is on our website all has copyright approval. So it's for educational use only, of course, but everything that's on there. And we have, I don't even know how many images, but huge number of images. But we have even more in our database, and we share that database, and you have to be on site to access it. All of you are scholars and professionals in the field, I can see. You can come here and access all of it, and we can help you do that. So please come back after this. I'm going to give a short introduction to Rui An and to Murtaza. Rui An is an artist. He's sitting in the front row with a light blue mask on. And you can keep the mask on. And anybody who feels more comfortable wearing the mask, please go ahead and wear the mask. We're sort of in a hybrid situation, I think is what you call it right now. He is from Singapore. He's an artist and writer working in the intersections of contemporary art, cinema, performance, and theory. His work primarily crosses the mediums of lecture, essay, and film. We have a film today. He's someone who's not as well known as he should be in the United States. No show here of any size, I don't think, certainly no solo show. But in Asia and in our world, he's a highly, highly respected artist and has been shown at the Bangkok Biennale, Asian Art Biennale, Guangzhou Biennale, Jakarta Biennale, Sharjah Biennale, Kochi Biennale, and in museums in Europe. And really, frankly, I do think that many of the museums in Europe are much more open-minded and much more forward-thinking than the very conservative museums in the United States, as I see some people from museums here in the audience. But it's true. I think it relates to funding, actually, and boards of directors and things like that. But I also think it's American myopia. We're very, very, very self-involved, I would say. Murtaza, is so wonderful to welcome you back here. You actually, I think it was 2012, maybe, it was really a long time ago, you moderated a talk with Naeem Mohiman, so I'm delighted to have you back. You're one of my favorite curators. You are a critic, a curator, and art historian based both in Sharjah and in Brooklyn. And your ongoing research interests include materialist art histories, eccentric minimalisms, ghosts, and other figures of liminal subjectivities and repressed histories, the weight of color, and contemporary art of the Indian Ocean littoral. I hope you will explain some of that. But Mertis has been a recipient of a Creative Capital Award, Warhol Foundation Art Writers Grant. You are the curator at large for Front International, the Cleveland Triennale, adjunct curator, which I think is where you're spending a lot of your time, at the Jameel Art Center in Dubai, and it goes on and on and on. I saw Ho Rui An's work in your exhibition at the Warehouse 421, which actually I've been to in Abu Dhabi, which is called Substructures Excavating the Everyday. Is that the series in which Rui An's work was in? Really interesting exhibition. There is something online about it? Maybe not? This is the things we have to do. Okay.
Yeah, I think they're revamping their website.
Yeah.
So hopefully there will be stuff.
Yeah. But anyway, welcome both of you. Longer bios are on the website, and I really look forward to this event. Thank you.
I just want to start off very quickly by thanking you all for coming and thanking everybody at Asia Art Archive in America, Jane and Furan especially, for inviting me and also organizing it. And of course to Rui An for his amazing work. This is kind of a little bit of a joke, but also kind of serious. Like Rui An falls into a category of artists who for me are simultaneously a dream and an absolute nightmare to work with or think about. For the simple reason that the work is so rigorous, so deeply researched, so formally and structurally intelligent, that on the one hand, as a critic and a curator, you don't actually have to do much to present it. But on the other hand, it completely makes it impossible for you to do your job, because nothing you could do could be any clearer or more crisp or sharper than the artwork itself. And he falls into that category most definitely. I have been drawn to his practice actually because I find him to be an incredibly sharp and precise kind of deconstructor of kind of the insidious effects of neoliberal economic policies, and specifically their relationship to authoritarian political structures. And this for me is really interesting as not someone who's super familiar with East Asia or Southeast Asia, but someone who works a lot in the Gulf countries. And so Rui An's films and his lecture performances I think actually are really good at unpacking what's happening in some of those countries as well. You know, it also interrogates the relationship between the West and the non-West, and the sorts of stereotypes and projections that the West puts on other parts of the world. And it also does interrogate what the definitions of freedom a system like free market capitalism actually allows for. How much of it there actually is ultimately, and who benefits from it, and how they benefit from it. So for all of these reasons, I find his work quite fascinating. I've presented his analysis of Singapore in certain, in relationship to certain topics in the Gulf context without contextualizing it any further, almost as a kind of analog, because I do think that some of what he's talking about applies just as easily to the Gulf context. So that's just in lieu of a very brief introduction. And so I have like about three or four questions. I'm sure other things will open up as we converse, just to kind of begin to unpack the film, and then hopefully a little bit later, as Jane was saying, we'll get an opportunity to hear from some of you. I'm especially curious for precisely the reasons that Jane identified. There are people who work in finance who know more about that aspect. There are people who are familiar with a lot of these national and economic contexts as well, more familiar than I am. So I'm really curious to hear those thoughts. So I thought we'd start off basically interrogating the subject of the film. So the film traces a trajectory of the student, quote unquote, as a political figure across East and Southeast Asia. This figure seems to shift between that of a budding technocrat and a subject of social engineering and statist indoctrination to a central component alongside other figures such as the worker or the peasant of a revolutionary politics or protest movements. So I just wanted to ask you a little bit about what drew you to this subject, this figure.
Yeah, so first of all, thank you, Murtaza, for doing this. We have been in dialogue for many years, so I'm very glad we could have this conversation together. And also thank you to Asia Archive in America for hosting this program. This is the first time I'm presenting this film in New York. So, and in many ways, it is a story that kind of implicates the US in very, very specific ways. So I feel like it's important to show this film here in this context. And maybe as a way to answer this question, I'll give a bit of a context behind the making of the film first, which was that I was researching into the Asian financial crisis, which is a moment that is just one moment in the film in 1997, 1998. And that was the basis for another work called Asia, the Miraculous. So there are a couple of books on the table there that address this entire body of work, which you can have a look later. And as I was researching that particular financial crisis, which was actually quite a major crisis, but it's often not narrativized within a kind of global economic history as compared to 2008, which is called the global financial crisis because it started here, as opposed to the Asian financial crisis. So already in that the way we name a crisis, there is this kind of logic of racialization, which financial crisis lays claim to the signifier of the global and which is an Asian financial crisis. But as I was researching that, I realized I couldn't look at that in isolation with what preceded it, which was this period of historical period that has been thematized as the East Asian economic miracle, which was describing the kind of unprecedented growth rates that were seen in several of these countries that you see being spoken of in the film. So these were like Japan, South Korea, Singapore, Thailand, Malaysia, that were experiencing this kind of rapid economic growth throughout this entire period. And sometimes, most of them, these are all capitalist systems, but sometimes adhering to a kind of US Western liberal capitalism model, but sometimes diverging from it in certain insignificant ways, especially vis-a-vis the relationship between the state and global capital. And so as I was doing this research, I started to find this, and as I do most of my, with most of my projects, you start to identify certain motifs that keep emerging. And one of it was really the figure of the student. And this referred both, this meant, I mean this in both a literal and also a figurative sense, because on the one hand, you had all these students, so the very first group of students that you see in the film are these, the 19 Satsuma students and the Chōshū 5, who are these Japanese students who went to the West to kind of acquire knowledge and technology. And then subsequently, you can almost trace the history of East Asian modernity, so to speak, or economic development through following these different groups of students. But also the students are a very unstable figure within these contexts. It begins with these students who come to bring kind of liberal capitalism back to their context. And then it also starts to produce all these resistances to the system, as seen in all the different student movements beginning from the 60s to the 70s to the 80s. And then with these movements dissipating, these students then become re-assimilated into the economic system as it is. So on the one hand, there is this story I wanted to tell that I saw kind of emerging by just following these different groups of students. And on the other hand, I was also very struck by the relationship that these East Asian, Southeast Asian countries had to each other, that they had to Japan, and also the relationship that Japan had to the US. And I think one of the key thread that runs across all these countries that are featured in the film is that all these countries were in some kind of patronage or tutelage relationship with the US. And if you read the literature of the time, there was this tendency to almost think of an entire nation as a student in relation to different teachers. So Japan was being called a student nation within the kind of American discourse. And then when Japan started developing, these other nations started to see Japan as a teacher. And of course, adding to this entire context is the fact of the status, the nature of public education in many of these East Asian countries, where the public education system, which is heavily state-funded, really becomes, this system to produce these kind of new capitalist subjects for the historical period that we are looking at here. So really, like, all these different factors started to coalesce, and I thought that the student body as a figure was something that was very useful for unpacking what was really happening throughout this history.
So the work is billed as a work of quote-unquote pedagogical horror, and that I think is from the description on your website. So can you speak a little bit about your interest in the genre and how it relates to the subject matter of the film? It's something, the way you do it is really, really subtle. There's an uncanniness and an uneasiness through the entire film, driven very much by the sound, by the audio, but also by the visuals, as I found out, which hopefully you will discuss as well. But it's hard to place or explain, and then right at the end you kind of get the denouement of, like, for, I know it's not technically K-pop, but like K-pop and Asian horror, kind of are intermeshed together. And then in retrospect, you're like, okay, I see. Yeah, so if you could speak a little bit about your interest in the genre and how it relates to, the subject matters of the film. I know there are many, so.
Yeah, so this film was commissioned by the Asian Film Archive, as you can see in the credits, which is an institution based in Singapore. And so the reason why I made the film was also because every year they would commission a contemporary art exhibition in relation to a film program during, I guess this is like kind of a Singapore, like a major month of art event in Singapore. So this is kind of a big thing that the Asian Art Film Archive does every year. And so they would, and the curator of that edition of, so that exhibition series is called State of Motion. And in that particular year, they wanted to focus on the film genre of horror. And so they would commission artists to make works. It doesn't have to be films necessarily, but to make works in response to the horror genre. And so this curator, Kathleen Ditzik, who I've worked with quite a number of few times, and she also wrote a couple of essays in the publications you can see on the table. She knew I was doing all this research around the Asian financial crisis, around the Asian miracle, and she asked me if I could conceive of these material being made into a horror film in some way or another. So I was working on that research for a commission for Gwangju Biennale that year, 2018. And that was meant to be a performance, and that performance, if some of you may have seen it, which was presented 3 years ago here in New York at the World Trade Center, that performance, I would characterize it as a bit of a tragic comedy in some ways. It's a stage show. And in a way, this is the horror version of that same material. And for me, it was also why horror felt particularly appropriate for me. On the one hand, of course, it is in some ways a horrifying history. There are moments of terror. But also because there's actually an economic narrative to be drawn here in terms of the emergence of the Asian horror genre. So if you think about Asian horror as a genre, it really came out after the Asian financial crisis, with your very first, most famous Japanese horror films being The Ring, that was about 2000s. And of course, you can read a lot of kind of the social malaise and the economic discontent into these films. But I think what's most interesting for me was, why did filmmakers, why did production companies turn to Asian horror in the wake of the financial crisis? And the reason is very simple, because they had no money. After the financial crisis, all your big production companies went bankrupt, so you cannot produce. I mean, in the lead up to that, you actually saw your big companies producing all these action thrillers, very Hollywood style, but then bam, there's no money. And what kind of film genre could you make with the least budget, but arouse kind of maximal reactions? And the answer was horror. essentially you didn't need to have a big star, a big celebrity. You can literally, ideally actually get a nobody to star, throw them into a room and scream and shout. And then you have a horror film. And I thought that was very fascinating in terms of this economic narrative as to why Asian horror emerged. So that was a bit of a backdrop to the whole context on why I felt like this material could be made into a horror film, partly because of how that genre itself emerged as, literally from the financial crisis. Yeah.
Okay. What's also interesting, it's just striking me now, is the role that students often play within horror films, especially in the Western context and slasher films. How the people, it's like Scream, right? It's a bunch of teenage kids. It's also associated with other urges and desires as well, and how those are navigated as well. So there's an interesting relationship there as well. I was wondering if you could describe some of the strategies you used, or you borrowed from the genre, or you used to kind of evoke the horrific from a filmic point of view. I know you're a student of film, like your knowledge of film from both Hollywood and Western stuff, and also Asian film, just based on the snippets that you've used in the works of yours that I've engaged with, is quite extensive. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, I guess for this particular film, one thing that I was really working with, especially in terms of playing with these genre logics, was really in the sound design of the film. And those of you who know of my performance practice, would know that in my performances, so I'll be very present as a narrator of these kind of histories. Whereas when I made this film, I decided not to have essentially, this kind of single narrative voice, or this kind of voiceover that's walking you through this entire history. Rather, I would like it to feel a little unlocated in that sense, like you didn't know from whose perspective was this being narrated. In fact, you had multiple perspectives. So all the text that you see in the subtitles, so they are all found material. So these were things that were said by different people. These were quotes from literature that was produced during this time. And then I decided to kind of not have them, to have them be articulated by this, kind of ghostly utterance that you hear, which was really a special texture that my sound designer Zai Tang and I worked together to kind of produce this kind of texture. And largely because I think for me, like, this film is really about, if I could kind of capture a certain ambience of that history, of these different moments, how would that ambience sound like? And for me, like, ambience is not, is this thing that seems to be everywhere, but also nowhere at the same time, because it's just kind of in the background of your existence. And it's not really locatable, it's not really fully embodied by any one individual. So that was, and I think for me, like, that is something that is quite classically horror in that sense, because especially when it comes to sound, why is it so horrific sometimes is you are unable to locate exactly where it is coming from. And usually the moment where horror dissipates is when you manage to locate, okay, this is where it is. But if you consistently can't locate it, then the anxiety and the suspense increases. So for sure, like, sound was definitely the key way in which I was trying to play with some of these genre logics, I would say.
I mean, the sound also is, it's hard to deny. Yesterday when we were speaking, you used the word sculpted, that your sound designer sculpted the sound. And I thought that was a really evocative way of describing it, because it does feel like that, especially, before the K-pop, when there's this kind of like cacophony of both quotes and the sound kind of really comes together. But were there also visual strategies?
Yeah. I think one of the key motives that you see in the film was also the presence of all these different technological apparatus. You saw, so that's supposed to be a photocopier, then you see television screens, computer screens, there was this old Betamax. And actually it kind of relates to the film at the end, The Ring, because The Ring, as a horror film, is actually a horror film that is centered around the anxieties around technical reproduction. If you remember the story, it's about this tape that you have to reproduce, keep reproducing. So in that horror narrative, and I feel like it's something that you can also read into Asian horror, these anxieties around technology, around the technological, and the kind of threats it presents to society. So there's certainly, like, at that level, that was why I was particularly invested in showing all these different kind of machinery in a way, you know, that as if they seem to have a kind of autonomy of their own in some sense. Yeah.
And also it's important to note also that a lot of those machines, I think, is a good way of describing it, or I was calling them electronic products because that was a term that was used a lot in the 70s and the 80s. They were also one of the ways in which, at least maybe the Asian miracle was economic miracle was most widely consumed. Maybe so like everybody got had like a Sony Triniton, like you were saying, or like early VHS Betamax, or like the dominance of Samsung and the Lenovo laptops or the IBM knockoffs kind of idea. It's also where this condescending relationship between the West and East Asia comes through. They were always considered to be knockoffs. Like the technology was not developed in these countries. It was basically like adapted and then produced more efficiently or more economically sound, in a more economically sound way. But can you talk a little bit about how you presented these objects?
Yeah, I mean, if you notice, it was very deliberate in terms of the particular choice of apparatuses because they pretty much correspond to the different. Actually, so when you see the Sony Trinitron, it pretty much was emerged around that timeline in the moment. Then you start to see your Samsung screens and other things started to emerge eventually. So of course there's, I wanted to also tell this economic narrative of these economies being propelled by the production of these electronic consumables. But also, I mean, I don't know how many of you would notice, but actually, so all the scenes that are set in the classroom, lecture room, actually that's completely a 3D animation. So all of these, so basically all the television screens, the Betamax, all these are 3D models. And actually when I conceived of this scene, I mean, one of my original ideas was actually, okay, should I go and buy all these different stuff and then try to put them together? And I realized this is like logistically impossible. And then I realized that you can actually buy all these models online in these online 3D markets. And I could even isolate a very particular like Sony Trinitron produced in 1960, whatever. So you could get, so I thought, okay, why don't I, so I essentially just did the whole thing in 3D eventually. And especially when you can get this, get this Betamax that was so, I guess, so accurate. I mean, I don't know where to find one these days to constitute the scene. So I would say that may be also part of the uncanny of the film, because in a way that scene doesn't exist in real life. It's itself a simulation of these different kind of technological apparatuses.
Yeah, no, I mean, for me, actually, that was, visually, that was one of the sides of the uncanny, because especially with the black and white footage, right, at the beginning of the film, you can almost see the edges between the archival footage and the screen that it's supposed to be playing on. Like, you can almost feel it, but not in a way that's very conscious, but very subtle. And it becomes less obvious later, maybe, because the footage and the screen that it's being projected on fit more seamlessly. But when you said that, I was like, for me, there was definitely an uneasiness that was coming from the virtuality of that environment that you created.
Yeah.
So I think I have one last question. We could talk forever about stuff, but I'd love to hear from other people in the audience as well. So my last kind of point that I wanted to bring up was that kind of despite the film's title, which says student bodies, images of actual living, breathing student bodies rarely appear in the film. When an image or a representation does appear, it is often as an inanimate proxy, frozen in time in a way. So like the figures in the museum display at the very beginning, these kind of glistening but completely still diorama figures, or the painted representations of the murdered students, student protesters encased in this marble monument at the university in Bangkok. So can you elaborate a little bit about this absence, like the absence of the actual like real or living student body?
Yeah, you're right that it's a kind of deliberate strategy to not, put the student, this kind of fleshy figure on screen in the film at any moment, and they only appear as mediations of the actual student. And I think a part of it is also comes from the fact that I think many of these student movements, these are very difficult histories to talk about, and they are very, very contested in many of these contexts, and sometimes romanticized, sometimes vilified. And so rather than try to present the student itself, I'm more interested in kind of presenting the student as already a kind of mediated form, like how these students are memorialized in monuments. So that was one of the strategy, on the one hand to show how these students were mediated. But then there was also the other part that I wanted to do was to show how these students, these student movements were also produced out of different kinds of mediations. And by these, I mean, you see all these different technological apparatuses. So I wanted to kind of showcase or bring up the kind of material infrastructure that produced these student movements. And so the reason why the photocopier for me was such an important motif as well was because if you look at, because it brings you back to university days, when you were photocopying stuff. But we don't do that nowadays. We don't have to anymore. It does. But for me, the photocopier, and I think it comes out most prominently in the part when I talk about the Korean student movements, when because in some contexts, especially in Korea, when leftist literature was officially banned and illegal, the photocopier would become a kind of key technological tool that you use to reproduce these left-wing radical literature. And very often these literature would be translated from Japanese translations of the original literature. So there's also this kind of process of translation and mediation. So on the one hand, so there was all these different mediations that produced the student that I also wanted to talk about. And of course the television screen, especially in 1968, was a key tool for the Japanese student movements to connect themselves with the kind of movements in Europe and America that was happening in that same year. All these different. So I would say like this question of mediation is really at the core of how I was thinking about the student and why I chose to present it as such.
Yeah, I mean the film kind of has the 1997-1998 Asian financial crisis as its kind of like end point, but you could very easily see that the next stage would be the cell phone and social media. Like it would be quite seamless, and it's also interesting to reflect back then on how that technological kind of evolution, the next step, is simultaneously the ways in which these drivers of the economic recovery are consumed and disseminated. So like K-pop becomes a global phenomenon, Asian horror becomes a global phenomenon, but also the ways in which mobilizations against authoritarian and capitalist injustices also circulate, right? So the central role that cell phones and social media play in movements like Occupy to a lesser extent, but like BLM, and even possibly we were speaking about protests in Hong Kong and things like that. I think maybe the last question I will ask really quickly, and then we'll open it up to people in the audience, is about another major absence in this film. And again, this kind of end point of 1997, 98 kind of maybe is the reason for that, but is China. And so I don't know if you wanted to touch on that or...
That's a bit of a big question.
Yeah, is it too big a question?
I mean, for sure. I mean, there was a question that I was confronted with a lot when I was showing this, because this was first made in 2019 at the height of the Hong Kong protests. So everyone was just like trying to engage me on a completely different topic when I was talking about this. But there are certainly relationships, for sure, but as I mentioned, these particular countries were chosen precisely because of that patronage-tutelage relationship with the US. So it was pretty much a kind of Cold War geopolitics that I was also trying to map here. I think to tell the story of student movements in China almost requires a different film altogether, that engages with these histories of socialism, as opposed to, these, this kind of capitalist patronage, tutelage system that you see between.
But my question to you would be, is there a radical break or a radical rupture between this economic model and China becoming ascendant in the late 20th, early 21st century?
I think
or is there a continuity?
I think there are both continuities and ruptures in the sense. Continuities in the sense that China was definitely examining a lot of what East Asian countries were doing, especially when you had this strong role of the state in creating these kind of market conditions. So for sure, and of course Japan was one of the first major investors into China when they opened up. So there was certainly this set of very concrete relationships. But I would say making a transition into a capitalist system from a socialist system is a whole different ballgame altogether. So I think there are also different complexities that would have to be mapped in the case of China that would be quite different from, I think, the histories of these other countries, I would say.